because with our schedule, we've arranged it that we're going to take Unit 4 test next week, and then we can have some time to get ready for a comprehensive review. So we're right back on the heels of another test, basically, covering chapter 10 through 13. Anyway, any questions before we get started? You all look like you're going to take lab finals this week. Good. Focus. Alert and awake. That's good. Awake is good. As I mentioned a moment ago, I'm going to apologize in advance. I did not get to re-edit this Chapter 11 presentation so that it looks similar to what we've been utilizing. But it's the same format. We're just walking through the text for it. So I'll try not to let you get buried in the text in the presentation. We'll just walk through some of these topics. Primary thing is, if you look at the learning outcomes on your handout, we're going to talk about just this term evolution, which we introduced last week. We'll talk about contributors to this concept called microevolution. We will talk about this scientist named Darwin. We'll talk about natural selection and how it does influence allele frequency. That's a question that we left with on Thursday. Well, what exactly is it? Just a change in allele frequency over a period of time in a population. And so we're going to say, well, what contributes to that? We'll also look at, as a result of those changes, how an environment can push or naturally select a particular trait by different methods, including directional, stabilizing, or disruptive selection. And in addition to natural selection, we'll see how genetic mutation, gene drift, non-random mating, and gene flow contribute to this concept of evolution. At the end, I have 3 more. If we have time, and we probably won't have time to apply this thing called the Hardy-Weinberg equation, which tries to help prove that evolution does occur by some mathematical applications of allele frequencies, real allele frequencies in populations. And we probably will talk about the maintenance of harmful alleles, so probably number 8. Well, we should get to number 8. And question 9 we probably won't address, but probably we should at least get to number 8. So 1 through 6 and then number 8. That's where we're going. So what I want to do is go back and review what we just briefly introduced to about evolution. And let's, in your handout, what did we say evolution is not? It's not a religion. It's not a belief system. What else? It is a theory, so it's not something that someone just made up. So we're looking at what it's not. Okay, so very good. We've got some things that it is. We said it has nothing to do with what? Religion or another theory called what? Creationism. It has nothing to do with big thing theory, creationism. It's a completely unrelated scientific theories that are out there. Mr. Arnold, do you have something else that you want to say? Not at all. Okay, so the question is, well then what is it? Okay, we went through, right, we talked about this, and because there's not a lot of widespread, I guess, knowledge about what it is, there's a lot of opening for what it's not. And so people who are not educated in the sciences tend to blend different theories and support things without evidence. And so that's why we get kind of heated when we talk about evolution. If you try to pare it down to the scientific observation, it's not so heated, if you will. When we start going out in society, someone who's anti-science tells you, well, evolution says that man was the first organism on Earth as a monkey. Okay, well, that sounds crazy. It probably is. And so go through and do some research. And so evolution isn't this theory that this right here, okay, that we started out as a monkey, right? Let me say that again. evolution of a man and woman? I mean, if you go out in the media, this is what we see, right? Okay, straight from a monkey, women continue to evolve, men do not, right? It's not that, okay? Certainly there's some evidence to support, as we've been mentioning. Someone said, well, if you, in talking about the lab, if you see a nucleus, it's eukaryotic. I mean, even if you compare yourself to a single-celled amoeba, there's some similarity. There is some genetic similarity. But there's not, like, this immediate link. Well, you must be amoeba 3 generations back. Okay, no. It's not that. But there has been, over billions of years, some genetic changes that has allow for the original rising of multiple species. And so we're going to see, well, what about, how can we observe this in our current state, where we are, where we're making observations in our world. And so, what is evolution? So, a textbook definition about evolution is that in a population, if you go back to the first day or two of class, we talked about the organization, the hierarchy of our biome, and we said in a population, so not in an individual, in a population, when some allele frequencies become more common and others become less common from one generation to the other. That's a very concise, succinct definition of evolution. Where there's just a change in allele frequency within a population over a period of time. So you can see populations evolving. And we define the word allele, italicized and asterisk here, and we know that's what? The variation of different genes. Okay, so a gene may have multiple alleles. We had a discussion over that last week. And so it's talking about within a population, the allele frequency changes. It's not always exactly 50-50 or whatever, right, from generation to generation. Any questions on that kind of simple definition of question? All right. So I'm going to skip that. We described that. And so what does that definition mean? Okay, so evolution is a change in the number of times of specific genes that code for specific characteristics, okay, within an interbreeding population. We're just seeing characteristics change within a population. So we're just looking at how often a particular gene is expressed in a population over a period of time. That's continuing to mate with itself. Whether it's you're looking at humans, or flowering plants, or amoeba in a pond, or weird sea creatures in the depths of the ocean. And if there's an allele frequency over a period of time, we can begin to see some evolution within that population taking place. So the next question is, on the bottom of your handout, it says, well, what can evolve then? Right? So what's the definition then? What am I fishing out of here? What can evolve? Well, anything living, definitely, but where is evolution observed? At what level of hierarchy is it observed? Within a population. Okay, so write that big bold. Right? What can evolve? Only populations. A population can evolve, not what? Not an individual. A population can evolve, not an individual. So what that means is, if a person gets cancer, they haven't evolved, they've got cancer. Okay? Only if a genetic change happens and they mate and pass it on, and that offspring passes that trait on, and now it becomes a unique characteristic, then we can see some observation going on. But you don't see evolution within an individual organism. We see it at the population level where we can begin to see some changes. I'm going to bump ahead some of these slides because this is an old presentation that I have, so I just want to make sure we kind of flow together a little bit better. So, big thing is, what evolves? Populations, not individuals. Okay? So we've got that. Write this one more statement down, the bottom one. Okay. There is no implication in improvement in evolution. So populations evolve, and there is no goal. There is no... Just because something may, a species or population may evolve, does not imply that they're better off with this allele frequency change. It may not be. And so just because something evolves doesn't mean it's necessarily good. Does that make sense? I'm going to move ahead. I don't know what is shown, but if we look at the history of evolution, we always go with Darwin. He's like the most well-associated scientist with this theory of evolution. But he's not the only guy, and he certainly wasn't the first guy to kind of have a hunch about this concept of evolution. So he was involved, but not the only one, and not the first person involved with this theory of evolution. So instead of writing all that, so you say Darwin's involved, but not the only guy. Not the first guy either. And your book has a nice little summary image of some of the folks involved with this concept of what we now call evolution. It hasn't always been called evolution. It's just a term that's accepted now by many people to describe what we're studying. So certainly Darwin is involved, but he kind of gave it the push for what it's recognized with. And so if we look at some history, make a reference to figure 11.1 in your textbook. And if you look at the history, it goes way back to... Some of the founding thoughts go back to Aristotle, the great philosopher. Okay. Gives us some implication about evolution. And he, if you look at his study, he says individuals in a species, he was beginning to make observations. He says individuals of a species were basically identical, is what he's saying. Right? So he's thinking about science, he's thinking about different species, but he thought they were all the same. So he's saying you and I are basically identical. Yeah. All horses are basically identical. All flowers are basically identical. So he's kind of thinking about it, right? He's in the world thinking about it. If we highlight a couple of other scientists, Buffon, he noted in the early 1700s, mid-1700s, he identified that he thinks when species just physically move to a different location, that something about them changes. So, for example, if a human moves from America and then moves to, say, Africa, something causes them to change. And so, kind of, now we know it's kind of maybe not the case, but what he's saying is there's probably something in the environment that does influence population and how species adapt to a changing environment. All right, so in addition to making this note about how species change when they go to a different location, Buffon was also involved with saying this concept that closely related species do have a common genetic ancestor. So he's kind of one of the first guys to say, well, they look similar. Maybe there's something similar about their past, their genetic evolutionary past. Okay, so like comparing a boxer dog to a terrier. Okay, maybe they are pretty similar. There's something common about them. Hutton, the third guy in this image, he noted that changes usually aren't abrupt, and they're just gradual, and that's why it's hard for us to visually see some changes because they are so minute, and just take a while to come about. He also had some idea about how the Earth physically changes and has an influence about, what is this term? I guess he was looking at sedimentation, basically, in the different layers of the Earth, and talking about, well, we see some changes in the Earth that have an influence probably on the past life, right? So the living organisms that were there, now what we call now fossilized in the environment. So he's beginning to notice that fossils in older layers of sedimentation look kind of similar, but a little bit different than what we see living in current day modern time. Who else? Cuvier, he noticed that after major catastrophes that that changes the environment so that some new species may emerge and other species may actually just become extinct and no longer exist. Okay, so, yes? No, I'm not going to hold you accountable for the history of these people. I just want you to be aware of the transformation that this concept of evolution, this theory of evolution has come from. We're looking at all the different thoughts. I think it's important to understand that it's not just Darwin, because a lot of people hammer on Darwin, but go back to Aristotle before Jesus Christ was documented. Okay, so no, I'm not going to hold you accountable for the history. I'm just trying to highlight the transformation where we're going. What else? Don't write these down, okay? So in some other scenarios, Lamarck, I don't know how to pronounce his name, talked about how characteristics can be acquired over a period of time based on fossil records, and also coming in with that concept of if there's no adaptation, a species may actually become extinct. And we have current examples of species that are threatened or actually extinct within your time, your lifetime, or within your parents' time. And some other scientists went back, right, agreed with data from, or scientists from back in the early 1700s, and said, yeah, I think there is a tie between extinct fossils or fossils of extinct species and traits that we see out there in the environment. So they're just making observations out there. Right. And then the next thing I have in your handout is what is the link to geology? How does something inanimate have a tie to our living biosphere? And yes, it's due to the presence of fossils. And which we'll study in better detail on Thursday. We'll talk about fossils, how they're formed, and how can we interpret where they're located. And if we look at the way that the Earth's crust, I guess, is assembled, it is arranged in different layers. And within those different layers, there are some fossils found. Okay, I mean, we know this. However, if there's been some type of catastrophic event, sometimes those layers actually shift, which we know we're experiencing on the earthquakes and etc. So a geologist has to be able to not only just look at anatomically physically where a particular fossil is found, it's got to be able to interpret the layer, the mineral deposits around that fossil to help better guesstimate the age of when that fossil was formed. And so we'll talk about a little bit in better detail on Thursday. So geology is certainly going to be part of our supporting evidence for this concept of evolution. So geology certainly helps preserve fossils. And it does change the location of some fossils if we're moving Earth or catastrophic events, whatever the case may be. But we're going to be able to look at these layers scientifically and make some interpretations. You can kind of get an appreciation of the variety of our Earth's crust. You go somewhere cool like Grand Canyons, you might have been there, several people. You don't have to get out of the state of Oklahoma, you just travel south. You may travel along 35 and you can see, is it the Wichita Mountains down there? The what? Arbuckle, thank you. you drive through the Arbuckle Mountains, right? You can see something really cool. You can see the layering in there. And if you take a geology class, if you're interested in geology, you could probably go down to the Arbuckle Mountains and look at the layers and maybe find some preserved species. Do it. It'd be good. It'd be fun. So anyway, so certainly we can use this fossilized evidence to help support this theory of evolution. But these things are fossil. They're dead. I mean, there's not a solid way to say, well, yes, this was this or whatever. We'll learn on Thursday that now we're able to extract DNA from the fossils. Some DNA is preserved, and so that's better molding our appreciation of genetic similarities or dissimilarities between different species. So if we look at Darwin, and it says, well, what did Gregor Mendel? Wow, I'm looking at my handout, thinking Mendel, change that Gregor Mendel to Charles Darwin. I was in a super rush putting this together. Gregor Mendel did not directly contribute to the theory of evolution, so he talked about our inheritance patterns, which you could argue that, but I just have a typo. Charles Darwin. Okay, so we're looking at what did Charles Darwin contribute to the theory of evolution. Again, don't worry about writing all this down. This is an old presentation. You notice I've been trying to be more succinct in my presentations to you guys this semester. So just a brief history about him. So 1800s, he was born in England, and he was described as being a naturalist, and he was able to go on a expedition on the ship called the Beagle, and it traveled the world. And through his studies, he was able to make some really neat observations about the diversity of different species throughout the world. And he went down to, he's most famously associated for the observations of the Galapagos Islands, Australia, New Zealand, he went all across the world. And so he saw a lot of commonalities, but a lot of unique species as well. Let me see if I had a picture of his map. I don't. I'm sorry. He did have a really cool journey. He went through and just kept a really nice logbook and made some observations of different species. So based on his findings, we kind of pushed this concept of evolution. Okay? He came up with this term called natural selection. So here's a quote from him, from his book that he wrote, The Origin of Species. And go ahead and write this quote down where it talks about what Charles Darwin, not Gregor Mendel, contributed to the theory of evolution. And he says, I've called this principle by which each slight variation, if useful, is preserved by the term natural selection. So he kind of coined the term natural selection. Focus on this word natural selection for a little bit. Anybody know what natural selection is? Or a good way to describe natural selection? It does coin in this term survival of the fittest. What is and let's elaborate on that. Okay, what does that mean? That's right. That's what the
The members of the population that are better equipped to stay alive.
Very, very good. So the key is to not only survive, but the key is to survive and adapt and reproduce. So the key thing is not only survive and adapt, but then you've got to adapt so that, reproduce so your genes are passed on. Yours collectively moving within. Not this year. So, this term natural selection. So we know that natural selection, again, I'm going to say in the section of the handout, is natural selection is those individuals who are best fit or adapted to their environment not only survive, but they also reproduce. And so if we look at some terminology about natural selection, right, at this point, just put it in concepts, right, Darwin didn't know about genes. If we go back to the timeline, he didn't know about genes. That's kind of new, so the terms about genes, but he did have some just physical observations. So we look at the observations that Darwin made in his voyage and throughout his experiences. Is one, he said, we'll go back to the contribution to Darwin. He said, one, he noted that organisms generally have more offspring than can survive. So most organisms will have more offspring than what can survive. So think about like the brown recluse spider in your house, okay? One little spider can have, right, way too many little babies, right? But you're going to kill them all, right? You're going to kill most of them. You're going to try to, right? Spray them and do all kinds of good stuff. So think about plants, fish, right? They're going to produce a lot of gametes. Hopefully they'll all get fertilized. So most organisms, obviously not all. I mean, humans are a clear example. Elephants are another example that don't fall into that. But most organisms tend to produce more offspring that then can survive into adulthood. Another observation that he made is that the offspring are not identical. And there is some difference between the offspring. So slight variations in their appearance, size, or whatever characteristics. Right? So a little bit of difference between them. And so based on these observations, he said if organisms have more offspring than they can survive into their individual adulthood, and there's differences among those offspring, well then of those offspring, those that are best suited for their environment are the ones that go on and survive and reproduce, or are naturally selected for survival. Okay? And that's where the term survival of the fittest, right, that we talked about comes into. So even within just a set of offspring, there's going to be some natural selection of those offspring that are better suited to survive. And they are considered to be the fittest for that environment. Same species in a different environment, what may work well in one environment may completely be a hindrance in another environment. And so it's a localized, right? Remember, we're still in a population, right? So a local area of the same type of species. Those are kind of the key things that Darwin kind of observed and came up with this concept of natural selection and this survival of the fittest as the offspring of a particular population. This is probably most well associated with his observations that he saw in the Galapagos Islands, looking at birds, finches. I mean, I'm not an ornithologist, so I see a bunch of birds. You may see a bunch of birds, but he went through and made some characteristic observations about color patterns, the size of the beak of these different finches, where they habited, okay, whether on the top of the tree, the bottom of the tree, wherever they fed, is always like, well, these are all finches. But if you look at just this snapshot, you can see just the genetic diversity here on this tiny little set of islands right around the equator, South America. Can you at least visually see some difference between these different, what we call finches? You can probably, their phenotype is different, so probably there's slight variation in their genotype. Very good. Right. So we went through and actually measured the beaks and made all types of observations. So natural selection happens naturally, but in our world where we rule, right, where humans rule, we also allow for artificial selection. How can we contrast natural selection versus artificial selection? What is artificial selection? Manipulation and humans are involved. And so that's what we like to do, right? We can't just let it well enough be alone. And so in that case, in that artificial selection, right, humans will choose traits and actually mate particular individuals to try to hopefully get a particular phenotype. They hope it, banking on the genotype kind of coming out, right? Working out in their favor for the phenotype. Classic example is the variation of foods which we eat. And so broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, kale, cabbage, all variants of a mustard plant. But I mean, clearly there is now a genetic difference between a broccoli versus a cauliflower versus a cabbage, right? Whatever. They all have been artificially selected for their unique fruits and structures. Another example is animals. Okay, so pets. And your book goes on about different variants of dogs. Like, dogs are a great example of artificial selection, where historically they've been selected to breed for different working conditions, right? So animals for hunting foxes, like beagles, or protecting, like German Shepherd, something like that. So they've been artificially selected. I mentioned the other day we're in the cattle business, so we do the exact same thing. We like this about this one and that one, so and hopefully you get a trait. So this one else is raise horses. Anybody else raise anything, mice or snakes or critters?
We have longhorn cattle, and we bought an Angus bull that's double homozygous for the no horn trait, so we get rid of the horns.
You got rid of the longhorn horns on purpose?
Yeah.
For the coat, or why?
No, because they're cheap to produce, and they're regular horns, so we want to get rid of the horns.
Okay, that's interesting. And how many generations did it take?
Well, we're just starting.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're doing your own genetic study. You'll have to let me know next spring how things work out. Yeah, send me an email. I'd like a picture. I may need to see. Because longhorn, they're a lot more efficient to feed, contrasted to say like an Angus cattle or something like that. But they've been selectively bred for huge horns. So there's another breeder in Texas thinking you're crazy, right? Because they want the big giant horns so they can sell them. But I mean, that's right. If you're trying to handle the cattle, you have to need facilities and they're going to get hurt, So anyway, so those are great examples. Good. Any other examples of chicken farmers here that are raising chicken eggs? No? Kid raisers, kid farms? So. Oh, yeah. Towini, I've not heard that one. So, yeah, designer animals. Yes.
What about, I know this is a little TMI, but sperm donation?
Yeah, yeah. That's a great example. It's not really TMI, it's the way we roll.
Yeah.
Sperm donation, so you can go through and look at a book, like I like this, I like that. And so let's even get to a genetic level, we are doing what we're doing. So there's some recent media about, up till now, we can very easily determine the gender of our baby by sorting. We talked about the sperm cells, at the Y or the X, there's a little bit of density, so you can actually sort sperm cells to determine the gender. That is a little bit of artificial selection. That's more gender, but trait-wise, we could go through and say, well, this person has an IQ of blah blah blah, and I have an IQ of this. Maybe they can bring my baby's IQ individual may go to the shop and pick out the tallest, darkest, most handsome, thick-jawed man in the picture, and then what they don't know is when he was little, his parents gave him growth hormone and whatever, blah, blah, blah. So, blurble? I would stop you if this weren't your own child, but. Yeah, which nobody knew. That's interesting. So we can certainly, the point is, natural selection is not the only thing at play. Humans were messing with everything, including genetics. And whether it's intentional or unintentional, just selecting a mate. So we can certainly influence externally outside of natural events. So, are you okay with the difference between artificial versus natural selection? Natural is just survival of the fittest. Artificial selection is what humans are breeding for, basically, whether it's a plant or fish or stock. Hornless longhorn. I can't wait to see these things. Okay. All right. So table 11.1 will restate what you wrote in there about what did Charles Darwin contribute to this theory of evolution. All right. Well, I'm going to bump ahead. I'm sorry. Just did not have time to fix this. If we look at natural selection and where we're going with evolution, as we noted, there's no ultimate goal in natural selection. It's just survival of the fittest, reproduction, continuing of genetics. And if we look at it, what happens when a particular species survives or organism survives, it passes its genetics onto what's considered to be your gene pool. Okay? And so, linking back to what we just mentioned a moment ago, the quantity may go up, but only a few of the offspring may be high in quality or survival ability to adapt and go on and reproduce. And so the question is that we had on Thursday is like, well, what about this term that we hear a lot? Well, what about microevolution? What the heck is it? And how does this tie in here? So I'm looking at page 3 of your handout. And I'm looking at what drives evolution. And there's this term called microevolution. It's evolution, but throwing the word micro in front of it. And does anybody remember the term we gave? How we defined it on Thursday? That was 5 days ago. Okay. So the key thing that I mentioned is that there's still a local, short, recent change in allele frequency within a population, or a particular species. So not in an individual. So microevolution is a quick change in allele frequency within a population or species. This is best observed, and like the example in your textbook, is looking at bacteria. Bacteria are phenomenal at letting us illustrate evolution because they are continuously evolving because their environment is continually what? Changing. So bacteria are a great example. Viruses also are a decent example. I don't like to really use it as a good example because viruses don't fall into our cell theory, but they do have genetic information in them, which evolves fast from fall to spring. Think about the flu virus. It technically is evolving. It's changing. That's why when you get one flu shot in 2013, you're not covered in 2014 because the virus's genetic allele frequency has changed. But if we look at it in something that is considered to be living, we can certainly see it in bacteria. And the classic recent example is staph. Anybody had a staph infection before? Yeah. Okay, it's very common. And what do? When you think you're getting an infection, what do? You go to the doctor or your friend and you get some antibiotics, right? Okay, there you go. You go get antibiotics. So you can change the what of the bacteria in your body? The environment. So that it's harsh and toxic to the bacteria so that they eventually hopefully die, right? We want those bacteria to die, to get out of your body.
When I got staph though, regular antibiotics, like oral antibiotics, didn't help.
Right. Because those bacteria have done what to the environment? Become adapted, resistant, and immune. They have otherwise, they have done what? They have evolved. So that what used to be lethal to them and toxic to them is now no longer lethal or toxic. And so we have to keep upping the ante on trying to kill the bacteria because they keep adapting and evolving so quickly. The question is, well, why are bacteria so good at this? Well, how long does a given bacteria live? Or less quantitative, how quickly can a bacterial cell undergo mitosis and produce a whole new offspring? It's in a few hours. So it's going to take you 15 to 30 years to reproduce, to make a baby. And it's going to take that baby 15 to 30 years to make a baby. So collectively, to get down to the F2 generation, you're looking at 45 to 90 years. And a bacteria might take how long? Hours to get through the next F2 generation. And if you start looking over a period of weeks or days or years, you think of the number of generations of bacterial cells, they're evolving and adapting moment to moment. Okay? So we can certainly see microevolution. Did they call it MRSA?
Yes.
Okay, so you had MRSA, which is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. What that means is that staph infection, a bacteria, is not going to respond in a negative way to penicillin. It's just now resistant to it. It's adapted. And so we can certainly see evolution. In this scenario, I saw a news header teaser just yesterday or over the weekend where some birds in an area that was radiated, I don't know if it's just read the header so I didn't get all the details, but some birds are now adapting to the environment of the high radiation, and they're surviving and reproducing, and so they're adapting. And so there's a real example of some evolution and current, right? So they look like normal birds, but a normal bird, if you took your parakeet out there, put it in that environment, still fed it or whatever, it's going to radiate, burn up, die, okay? But now there's some birds that are adapting to this environment, so there's something genetically happening about them. So there are some real scenarios of microevolution, but it's probably best appreciated if you think about it, especially if you've experienced MRSA, where you are hospitalized and takes some powerful antibiotics and takes a powerful punch on the body. So microevolution, what I'd like for you to add, in addition to your definition and some examples, is it leads to what's called macroevolution. Microevolution leads to macroevolution. Macroevolution is those big changes that we can see. Like this species of hyena was different from this group of hyena, and they don't even interbreed anymore. Okay? They're completely different. So we can actually see divergence of species. We can actually physically measure. And the next thing I have on your handout on page 3 is about adaptation. And y'all did the scenario about adaptations. Y'all remember the little feeding apparatus in lab? Your different adaptations ensured your reproductive success. Okay? And so, however, whatever an organism's adaptation to an environment should hopefully ensure its reproductive success. If an organism reproduces, its alleles, it's got more staples in the allele frequency in that population. So let's get some examples of adaptation of particular species. You might see how they're fighting it out in the world. Land, air, sea, not an organism that has an adaptation that. Okay, so what about sharks? How are they best adapted to their environment to ensure their reproductive success? Okay, so what they eat is determined by what? Their mouth structure. Okay, so a shark can survive. It's adapted to its environment, so it can not only open its mouth and eat something, but open it wide and forcefully. Okay, so they've adapted to, depending on the species of shark. So I'm thinking like great white sharks. There's obviously different species of shark. You think about a big great white that you guys are probably most familiar with. They can open their mouth wide and quick and fast and powerful. Okay, so they can ensure when there's prey available, they can quickly grab it and survive. Compared to a great white shark that's like, like, hey, little fishy, like luring in, right? Right, obviously, it's not a real scenario because sharks wouldn't live.
In the book, didn't they use spiders with like inside of like one on the mouth?
I haven't read this edition, but there are certainly some species that do that to ensure, like, make sure that those gametes are going to make it out, make the fertilization. So sometimes reproductive success means sacrificing yourself. I read that and I was like, what? There's a lot of cool examples. Another example that I'm thinking of is the cuttlefish. Okay, so they're almost like a squid kind of soft organism. They live in the sea. And some cuttlefish, male cuttlefish, can trick the other fish around them and they'll look like a female. So other big male cuttlefish are like, I'm a male, I'm not going to act like a female. And the other one will blend in. So the one male cuttlefish will kind of swim away while the one that can appear feminine sneaks in, gets the job done. Okay? Gets the job done, ensures reproductive success, and the other male has no idea. And so you can have some type of adaptation, like physical adaptations, chemical adaptations, whatever the case may be. But the whole point is to try to ensure reproductive ability. So the next thing I have on your handout is about natural selection. It may actually eliminate some phenotypes. It may eliminate the phenotypes. It may not eliminate the what? Genotype. Okay? And so sometimes some phenotypes may disappear, but genotypically is still coded for. An example that we had in the classroom a moment ago about the skin pattern of the parents versus the offspring. The offspring looks like maybe come from a Caucasian family only, and really skin-wise, right? So if you just look at the skin only, you say, well, she must be from a Caucasian family, but genotypically not the case. This will be pretty true in the next generation, probably. And so what I want you to add here is just because a phenotype disappears doesn't mean that the genotype shouldn't go away unless there's like a mass extinction of a group of species. But the genotype will be hidden in the heterozygote organisms. The other note that I have there on page 3 is about natural selection. I already identified. There is no goal. There is no goal to natural selection. There is no goal to evolution. It's just term sums it up best. Survival of the fittest. The whole point is to survive in this world. Whether you're a bacteria, living on someone's skin, okay, when you're in the hospital, okay, or you, fish in the sea, whatever, everybody's just trying to survive. Everything is just trying to survive. And so we're hoping that there's a genetic advantage to ensure individual survival. There's no goal. And so that leads us to that term that we identified called survival of the fittest. Now the question mark there, that one was actually intentional. Again, let's restate. What's the purpose of this? What is that? Survival of the fittest. What's the term fittest mean? Those are our best adapted to. I'm going to modify the term strong because strong conjures up to me like physical strength. And physical strength may not be necessarily important to an organism's survival. But the ability to adapt to an environment, to survive, and be learned to reproduce. Key thing is survive, adapt, and reproduce. Do it? Yes, and overcome this harsh world that we live in. Any questions thus far about this term, natural selection or survival of the fittest?
What do we mean when we say that it has no goal?
There's no master plan. It's random. There's no goal. It's random. Do what? There is no primary objective. There's no goal. There's no evidence to support a master plan. And so it's just the little rat that crosses the road and he gets squished on the road. He got naturally selected out. But his litter mate, who is smart and able to look, naturally selected. And so something about those two siblings, one was able to pay attention, the other was not, and it survived. And so hopefully the one that made it across the road, its little baby would also be capable of being responsible for the environment. And there was no master plan, but you will die, you will survive, you know. Do it? Yeah. Let's run faster. So that's what that means. There's no goal, there's no objective, it's just a response to the changing environment. There's no goal, and what you can add in there where it says there's no goal as well on page 3 is there's no ultimate species or variation. I mean, we're humans, so we're thinking, well, we've got to be the best, right? Well, we're different than a bacteria. If you're getting put in the hospital because of a bacteria, which one's better? If you want to go say who's better, a little bitty single-cell bacteria. But then you have a nucleus. Well, come on, right? They're very well adapted. Okay, so there's no better, worse, whatever. It's just making observations. Those species that can survive and reproduce are better fit for that environment than those that cannot. Does that help a little bit? All right. We turn to page 4 of your handout. In addition to natural selection, we can make some observations about how it can have an influence at the population level. And there's different types of selection, including what's called directional, stabilization, and disruptive selection. So on page 4 of your handout, I've just got them in column, okay, so you can see the 3 things in column. Can you see how the handout's working?
Is stabilizing selection testing
Yes. I don't know what happened. So if you have one of the variations where I didn't fix it, sorry about that. Thought I caught that and I guess I took the wrong format. So it is in columns. So the depending on the variation of the form which you've got, there may be a error. So we have directional, disruptive, and stabilizing selection. So go ahead and change those columns if you need to. And again, I'm sorry. I don't work well under pressure. So we're going to go through and compare these different types of selection, of natural selection. The terms kind of describe themselves. Directional, you're moving towards one phenotype or the other. Disruptive, there must be a break. Very good. And stabilizing, things must be a little bit more balanced. Okay, so let's look at some real scenarios of each of these. And I'm just using the images from your textbook. Looking at the image on the far right, in directional selection, when the environment changes, one phenotype is more favored than the other. So the classic example are some moths in England, about some more dark versus light colored moths. And depending on the environment, in the environment where it was real polluted and yucky, which one do you think would survive better in the environment? The darker one, because it blends in, versus a lighter color one. The lighter colored one is going to be lunch, for something, a bird or something like that. So it's going to be naturally selected out in a dark environment, like a polluted type of environment. But what if winter comes and these things are still buzzing around for some reason in the winter and it's snow everywhere, right? Which one would be the lighter colored one? And so even just as the seasons change, some species have this directional selection. You can see it here in Oklahoma in the summer coming up, those nasty little buzzing insects, grasshoppers. We're really familiar with drought. What color grasshoppers do you think are going to survive better? The yellow-brown colored ones are going to survive better than the ones that are green. So you go to the next year, you're going to have a higher proportion of yellow-brown colored grasshoppers that survive, and fewer than the green. But will all the green ones become extinct? No, they're going to survive. Then we have a lush year. We'll direct the opposite way. And so directional selection is usually you just push to one phenotype or the other. You see more of one, less of the other. If conditions change, the tide flows back. You okay on the term directional? In your handout, if you want to, you can just draw this little shift in directional. It's favoring one phenotype. Just draw the little arrow, little curve, where it's more on one side than on the other. Am I okay to move away from directional? The next type of selection is called disruptive selection. And in disruptive, in this case, we have our allele frequencies. We have the dominant trait expressed, the recessive trait expressed, or a blend, a heterozygous type trait. And in disruptive selection, that blended pattern is not favored, yet either extreme are favored. And so you can see how the pattern on the bottom, the blended pattern is not favored, but the other two favored. And this is looking at just some relative numbers, like without quantitative implications. You can see I'm interpreting the chart on the bottom. There's more of the far left extreme, more also on the far right, but the blend not favored in this scenario. So the extremes are favored, not the blend. The intermediate heterozygous type of combination. We can certainly see in that chart, population chart, the destruction right there in the middle where it's not equal. And a third type of natural selection is called stabilizing selection. And you're familiar with, they have a great example of stabilizing if you look at human baby birth weights. And this is more like a bell curve, where it's almost the opposite of that destructive, where that blend is the preferred genotype and the extremes are not. So if you think about birth weights of humans, there's obviously an ideal weight range in the middle. Think about babies. If they're anatomically, the mom's okay with having a 2-pound baby, right? But is that a 2-pound baby going to survive well on its own, if at all? No. As the weight increases, though, survivability for the mother and the baby reaches a maximum. But then, if the baby weight gets too big, what happens? So think about like your 10, 15-pound baby. Yes, yeah. What's going to happen? Bad stuff. And without medical intervention, if we were just doing this naturally, everybody's like, even the males are cringing.
You'll have to have a baby.
One or two people are going to die. Okay? Sooner thereafter. And so, physically wise, you think like, well, bigger baby better, right? But you got to get the baby out. Okay? So there's physical limitations to that. So the stabilizing, right, so where the either extreme phenotype is not favorable, but the intermediate phenotype is favorable. And so the human birth weight is a great example of stabilizing selection. Okay, these are the different types of selection. Do you have any questions about those where we're looking at another variation?
I got a question. Observation of this. A lot of tree frogs all night.
Okay.
Like last summer, I had one that had a tan-colored storage suit. And other trees right next to it. One of them jumped off the tree and started to cover, like tan, cover up my building. And then it jumped back over on the tree and immediately.
I wonder what kind of tree frog that is. So he noticed that the animals in his, just in this little, in your area, in your environment, so tree frogs would change from the location of a tree to a building, and he noticed the physical color looks different. So some organisms do have the ability to change colors. So like chameleons are most popular with color changes. Some lizards can do this. Squid can do this. And I guess tree frogs can do it as well. And so they can, it's another form of adaptation. If they adapt quickly to the environment, they'll be less likely to be eaten. And so they are happy at your place. They are reproductively sound. The tree frogs are good singers. Yeah, so I mean that would be one advantage to that particular species of frog is that they can blend into the environment when it changes and quickly. So yeah, so they just adapt very quickly. They're built to adapt quickly. So that can certainly may not. I guess what you're saying, I'm trying to make the observation, it doesn't have to take as long as season or birth of a baby. It can be a moment type of change as well. All right. So another type of scenario is like, well, what about the traits that aren't just kind of one extreme or the other? And so, if you remember, we said in natural selection, one phenotype may be favored, but we don't completely eliminate a particular allele. So just because the allele is present, it may not be expressed. So that leads to something called heterozygote advantage. I'll come back to that. I'll clarify that. Because we have multiple alleles persisting in an environment, again, there's no net good or bad. Okay, bad allele. Right? There's none of that going on, whether or not it contributes to survival or not. Sometimes, right, our alleles will persist in a particular population. And that can lead to what's called the heterozygote advantage. Table 1112 kind of illustrates the advantage of having or being a heterozygote for a particular trait. So, for example, cystic fibrosis, another disease called PKU, sickle cell, we talked about it the other day, Tay-Sachs disease you may have heard of, non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus. These balanced type of polymorphisms that at least this heterozygote advantage. So if you think about cystic fibrosis, obviously we consider that a disease. An advantage of that is those people actually are not susceptible to cholera, right, which is a diarrhea-causing disease. Okay, so, like, well, but you won't get diarrhea, okay? But, so, they're not susceptible to this type of infection, right, which other people would be like, I would like to not be susceptible to that. But the offset is carried in this disease with cystic fibrosis. G6, PD-glyceraldehyde phosphate, again, the full name of the enzyme, but lacking that enzyme can actually protect against malaria. PKU, this is actually tested at early pregnancy. One of those little tests they do for little babies. If you don't show urea, if they have this, the person is diagnosed with disease, they actually are not susceptible to a particular type of fungal infection. So there's some weird, right, diseases that we might consider bad, but there's advantages, right, to them in other unrelated, right, scenarios, if you will. This disease called Tay-Sachs disease, also tested for in early, right, infancy when someone's newborn. They have the immune tuberculosis, and so there's these weird, I don't know, weird's not the right term, but blended traits, or what are properly called balanced polymorphisms, where they have a known disease, but they have protection against other diseases or other conditions. And so they have that heterozygous advantage to that.
What if a disease was maybe as dominant, so the person was coded for the disease and that dominant?
Like, let me just try to make sure I understand what you're asking about this a little bit better. So they're not a heterozygote?
Well, if they are, but the disease is dominant,
Okay.
would they code it the disease because they have that dominant?
Yeah, so if there's a dominant traded disease, and there is, yes. That's a difficult question to answer without looking at specific conditions. It could be. It may not be. It may be one of these heterozygous. If it's a heterozygous condition, it may not be expressed traditionally, like we look at the Mendelian trait. It may not fall into that heterozygous parasite, and it doesn't really get the type of disease. It's not just an on-off kind of thing like people kind of tend to be. If we look at how this happens in addition to natural selection, on Thursday, I want you guys to read ahead about mutation, non-random mating, migration, and genetic drift, including the founder effect and the bottleneck effect. So on Thursday, we'll start out with just these additional factors that contribute to natural selection and evolution, or evolution besides natural selection, and then we'll look at fossil records and stuff on Thursday. So we'll go ahead and conclude here. Did I pass her the sign-in sheet? I did. I didn't get it. Okay. If you came in late, you could sign in on your way out, and I will see you guys on Thursday. I hope you do great on your lab finals. And